Hey, how you doing? This is my response to Tracy Longbond's Module 5 comments on Gadamer and David Harvey. So I want to give you some of my thoughts about what she had to say, and also give you a little bit of context for both Gadamer and Harvey, and then try and tie all of this in a little bit to some of the issues we've been dealing with so far. The first thing I want to mention, though, is that I've put another discussion list up, and it's going to be one that we're going to go back to on a regular basis. I put an announcement out there as well. This is a discussion that's going to try and harness some contemporary examples that we can look at in connection with some of the issues we're raising. And so I put up the first one. It's an essay in the New York Times in a section called The Stone, which is basically their philosophy section, and it's on depression and psychiatry. And I think it really interestingly picks up some of the issues on knowledge, responsibility, and society that we have been picking up in this course. What does it mean to to claim we have knowledge about somebody's mental condition? How does that affect social policy? How does that affect ethics? Are we pathologizing somebody? Is it a moral sort of judgment as well as a medical judgment that we're giving? I mean, often mental health issues shade between moral and mental health sorts of concerns. So it seems to me there's a lot to play with. There's a lot of interesting stuff that we can work with there. So go take a look at that, make some comments, and the purpose of this is for you to be able to put up stuff you find as well. So if you see something in the paper or see a video or whatever, just make another comment under that discussion, and we can all chime in on that one as well. I'd like to see if we can apply this as much as possible to, to apply the content of the course to stuff we see around us. Because I think once we start seeing that, it's going to become home. It's going to become, clear why this is, this stuff is really important. So, make sure to do that. Okay. So, Gadamer and Harvey. So, Tracy gives us a kind of a good background to Gadamer and Harvey. She gives us a bit of a sense of who Gadamer is, and how he's working with on the border of science and what amounts to humanities. So let me fill in a couple of things that are raised by her comments. As she notes, Gadamer is a student of Heidegger's. That's very important. He is not the same thing as Heidegger by any means, but he is a student of Heidegger's. He's generally not seen as being tainted by Heidegger's questionable politics, which we talked about a little bit last week. Gadamer's major work is called Truth and Method, published in 1960. He's mainly known as an essayist, although that work is very famous for him as well. And it's the work where he really kind of establishes what the hermeneutic method, okay? And the hermeneutic method, it's actually not just a method. It's in a certain sense what happens after method is over. His book, Truth and Method, the title could be understood in a certain sense as truth begins where method ends, okay? So what he's doing here is he is trying to say, how do we get at truth? I mean, this is Heidegger's issue as well, right? How do we get at the question of truth? I mean, we think of it as something that's objective and out there in the world, but the fact is, if what Heidegger said is correct, we are embedded in an always already meaningful world. And so we are always caught up in the issue of interpreting, not simply in the issue of perceiving. Okay? So as I look around my world, as I look around my office right now, I'm in my office and I look around, this is a place that makes sense to me, partly because I'm the one that put the books on the shelf and strew the papers indiscriminately everywhere, and all of that. I mean, it all, in a certain sense, has meaning in a way that to somebody else it wouldn't, and certainly to somebody else coming from, let's say, another culture or country, it really might be a very strange place. So, in a certain sense, I come to this place already being able to describe and to tell you, as it were, true things about the place in ways that, and that is made possible because I have a history of meaning within this place. Okay. Now, does that mean that I am, I necessarily understand everything about it? Well, no, of course not. Actually, definitely not. It is entirely possible that somebody could come in here and say, oh, that's interesting, you have that book, that thing on the wall. You put these things together, And I could say, you're right, I never saw that before. I mean, this happens to me all the time when I talk to my friend Keith, the artist. You know, he'll paint something, he'll draw something, and we'll stand there and look at it, and I'll say, well, you know, look at this is interesting what you did here. And he said, I just did that. I didn't really, you know, it just felt like the right thing to do. You know, it felt like it fit. And I would say, well, you know, I think what you're doing here is, you know, we could understand through Freud, or we could understand it through, you know, in any number of ways. The point is, I am not necessarily the best reader of my own space, even though I have a history of meaning within it. And see, for Gadamer, that's very important. He has this notion that we have a kind of horizon of meaning around us. It's like a big circle. And if you think about Venn diagrams, we're always bumping into other people's circles. We're always overlapping more or less with other people. You know, people we know well, there's a great deal of overlap. From somebody from another culture, there may be just very little overlap at all. But that's a very important space, that overlap. He talks about it he sometimes talks about it as prejudice, and he doesn't mean that negatively. He means prejudice as the sort of thing where I know my own world. You know, I am oriented towards my own world. Not that I, you know, am prejudiced in the sense of being negative towards somebody. You know, it's prejudice in the sense that when I know my own world, it takes work for me to understand somebody else's world. I mean, that seems banal. It seems straightforward. But, you know, it's the beginning of something I think quite profound. He also talks about tradition. And not in this essay here. I mean, these words do not come up in this essay, but I'm giving you a bit of background to understand what he's doing here. He talks about tradition as well. And for Gadamer, tradition is this idea that the world of meaning we find ourselves in is a world that precedes us, predates us, that we have inherited, but that we also contribute to. You know, in other words, it's not just you know, a thing that we swim in that we have no part of. We are in a constant process of changing it. And we change it in a variety of ways, including our encounters with others. And so, for example, you know, on a large scale, we might talk about the American tradition, whatever that is, right? I mean, it's hard to identify a single thing, but, you know, whatever it is that we identify that as being, we can also see that it changes over time. I mean, let's take the 60s, you know, in music. There's an encounter with Britain, the British invasion, they call it. And, you know, the Beatles come over and Rolling Stones and all these bands come over. And so there's an American tradition in music, but that changes, that morphs over time with the encounter with British music, you see. And so it takes a different path. Is it no longer American? No, it is American. You know, being American in terms of music is not just a kind of hermetically sealed thing. It's about a history of encounters that make the American tradition change and grow and so forth. The same could be said about any personal tradition or any religious tradition or anything like that. So we have this notion for Gadamer that in a certain sense truth happens within that space. You know, we say true things within the space of a world that is already meaningful and has a history to it and so forth. Does that mean that truth is relative or it's just whatever we make up? No, it's not. Gadamer's not a relativist in that sense. He is somebody who is trying to say we can't suppose that truth in some way precedes our engagement with the world. It's not something that just lies out there apart from us. It's something that we always have a part of. And it's why we talk about things like partial truth, you know, and the whole truth and things like that. I mean, is the whole truth ever the whole truth? No, not really. You know, the whole truth is still a partial truth. It's still highlighting certain aspects of the truth. It's still truth from someone's point of view, articulated by someone, even if it's a group of someone's. And so, you know, all of this means, if we now go to the essay that Tracy talked about, you know, this essay here is the essay in which Gadamer is trying to distinguish the doing of science from the doing of philosophy. And he's asking the question, you know, is there a philosophical element in the sciences and is there scientific elements in philosophy, okay? And, you know, this is a question that goes a ways back, certainly into the 19th century. Certainly in Germany, it's a very important question. Gadamer looks back to people like Wilhelm Dilthey, D-I-L-T-H-E-Y, Dilthey. And Dilthey is the person who distinguished between what he called, and I'm going to give you the German here so you can impress your friends, Geisteswissenschaft and Naturwissenschaft. Okay, so Geisteswissenschaft is literally spiritual knowledge, but it really gets translated as the human sciences. Right? Science is about humans. Naturwissenschaft is the sciences about nature, or we sometimes call them natural sciences or the hard sciences or something like that. And so that's the distinction in a certain sense that Gadamer is really trying to make here. How is it that we know about humans, and how is it that we know about the natural world, and what's the relationship between those two things? Are they the same thing? Now, if you think back, someone like Auguste Comte is going to say, yeah, they are the same thing, and the sciences of humans need to be reduced to the sciences of the natural world, right? There really is no sciences of humans. There really should be sciences of the natural world in the sense that there should be physical laws and cause and effect relationships and all of that stuff about humans, okay? Fairly popular notion, by the way, throughout the Enlightenment and through the 19th century as well. So Gadamer, though, is skeptical that you can do that reduction quite so easily. He thinks that just as if you were to look at a corpse of a person and say, you know, let's say, well, there's an arm and there's a leg and there's a head, we could take those apart, we could, you know, do an autopsy, we could do, I mean, all that stuff, you know, is that the person? Well, no, the person is not reducible to its parts. There's something more going on for someone to be a person than the assembly of parts. So Gadamer is interested in what we are as a whole, not simply what we are reduced to something that doesn't anymore look like us. And so, you know, when Gadamer thinks about what it means for science to be philosophical or philosophy to be scientific, he is not subscribing to the notion that we should somehow disregard science or something like that. That science, I mean, he's not anti-science. He, you know, he thinks of science, you know, as something that's not reductionist, like, you know, the way Comte would think of it. But he does think that there are limits to science. And by the way, Immanuel Kant thought this as well, right? So in that sense, Gadamer is like a Kantian, not a Comtean, but a Kantian. He is not like those who today might question, let's say, global warming or something like that, based on the rejection of scientific practice entirely. You know, the notion that the entire scientific community is all a big, you know, conspiracy theory, and, you know, there's really no science and all of that sort of thing. I mean, he would not subscribe to that. He would say science still does what it does. What we want to be able to do is to see how we can relate human beings to that and not lose them, not reduce them to something less than what they actually are. And so when he thinks about philosophy being scientific, he is interested in a certain kind of rigor for philosophy, but his hermeneutic method is a method which looks at, you know, which really tries to focus in on human beings as actors in their own worlds, as moral beings, as social beings, all of these sorts of things that are not reducible to regarding us as atomistic or as you know, just cause and effect things within a kind of you know, abstract relationship. So in other words, he's going to be skeptical, although not entirely rejecting, of, let's say, marketplace solutions to human action. You know, in other words, we are not just what a market tells us we are. We are not just, you know, actors within a market that are just like little forces that have wants and needs and desires and so forth. You know, we're more than that, right? We have morals. We have, you know, something that cannot be reduced to marketplace mechanisms or scientific cause and effect relationships. Now, he's not necessarily going to tell us exactly where we should go from there. I mean, he gives us examples in some of his other books. He looks, for example, at healthcare, at the notion of health in general. This is long before concurrent healthcare debates in the U.S. But he looks at the notion of healthcare not just as healthcare professionals solving a scientific problem, and that problem happens to be you, who has an illness or something, but rather a hermeneutic problem that is a problem of understanding. So it's a much more broad issue. We have to understand a person in their cultural context, with their feelings and needs and their religious beliefs and all the rest of that. It's not just that you can stand at arm's length and say, okay, you're a body just like all other bodies, and you know, here's what happens to bodies under the conditions that you have, and therefore that's what you have. Gadamer finds that inadequate, and I think a lot of healthcare professionals today would probably also find it inadequate. We're moving more and more towards, an understanding of what health is that's much richer, that's much, much more willing to take into account people's full life experiences and their stories and things like that. I mean, there was a time in medicine that doctor really, didn't really want to talk to the patient that much. What they want to do is look at the patient, right? The more the patient talked, the more that there would be kind of obfuscating data involved. Well, I think, at least in some medical circles, I'm hoping at least, we're moving away from that notion that the patient as a human being is irrelevant. It's only relevant, the person's only relevant in terms of being a body. Okay, so that's Gadamer, and I think that's part of what Gadamer's trying to do in this essay. I think, he's trying to tell us if we want to do science, and remember, our notions are knowledge, responsibility, and society, epistemology, ethics, social philosophy. If we want to do science, in other words, if we want knowledge, we cannot have that knowledge divorced from ethics and from social philosophy. We can't start with the truth about things or the knowledge about things and then go from there, the way some people might want us to do. We have to take it all together. So I think that's one thing that Gadamer introduces to this, and in a certain sense he is resisting certainly Comte and certainly Mill, but arguably also Marx, right? I mean, in the 19th century, Marx might also want to reduce us to, specific kinds of things in society, consumers and producers. So, he's going to want to resist all of those, what I'll think of as reductionist sorts of approaches. All right, so let's go on and talk about David Harvey for a little bit. And Tracy talks about Harvey's, first example of the disaster in Hamlet, North Carolina, the Imperial Foods disaster where a bunch of people were killed. She talks about, some of the sociological and philosophical issues that come with what Harvey's trying to talk about. I think she's quite right. She talks about his final observation isn't full of hope or despair, nor is he as condemning against all parties as forcefully as he could be. Yeah, I think that's right. I think he's not trying, at this point at least, to come down on a particular political side. I mean, clearly the tenor of his work is pretty leftist, and that's where he is. I don't think he should be ignored or ruled out because of that, just as we shouldn't rule out or ignore people that are on the right because of that, okay? What he's doing is, I think, presenting an argument. And he's presenting an argument in a certain sense parallel to Gadamer's, although not the same as Gadamer's. They're both arguments that are asking us to resist a certain kind of reductionism and take humans into account in a more kind of holistic manner. Harvey's approach to this is to think about humans as he's resisting both what he terms postmodernism and also, to some extent, what he thinks of as a kind of reductionism on the right as well. And, so let's take up the postmodernism issue, because he's written quite a lot about that, and quite scathingly, and including in this essay. And it's interesting, because if you think about the kind of currents of politics on the left, there is a kind of fault line between, it's a long-standing fault line between what we might think of as classic leftists, and you would think of those as people for whom the issue of class is the central one, the issue of economic class particularly. So they're rooted in Marx in a kind of broad sense, not necessarily communist by any means, but socialist in a very broad sense. So there's that group, and then there's what you might think of as the identity politics groups, the ones who are interested in issues of race, class, gender, and all of those sorts of things. Clearly there's a lot of play back and forth between these, but there's also actually tension between these, okay? And Harvey, I think, exhibits some of that tension in this essay. I mean, what he sees as what's going on in some of the race, class, and gender stuff is a kind of abandonment of any notion of a universal. And this is really the kind of crux or the core of the complaints that the different versions on the left have against each other. The kind of old-style leftists really do believe that there is kind of a universal core to ethics and to politics and things like that. That's what we're aspiring to. That's what gives us the basis for criticizing, the abuses in governments or in states, halfway around the world or something like that. If we didn't have that, all we could do is say, well, we don't like it, right? We don't have a kind of universal base for our ethics or for our politics. We just don't like it. And so Harvey exhibits that. Now, those on the other side will be very kind of vociferous in their rejection that that's what you end up with. I mean, I think most of them would say, even if you reject some notion of a kind of bald universal, you still have the ability to critique, actions and behavior elsewhere. So that's part of the argument. By the way, there's a fissure on the right as well. We're going to see that in a moment too. So Harvey is speaking directly to that notion of postmodernism that would get rid of any kind of universal because he wants to maintain a sense of justice. Here, let me read for you a paragraph. Social justice for all of the universalism to which its proponents of a particular version of it might aspire has long turned out to be a rather heterogeneous set of concepts. Notice there's a bunch of concepts involved. Furthermore, situatedness, otherness, and positionality, usually understood in the first instance in terms of class, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual preference, and community, though in some formulations even these categories are viewed with suspicion, also become crucial elements in defining how particular differentiated discourses, be they about social justice or anything else, arise and how such discourses are put to use as part of the play of power. There can be no universal conception of justice to which we can appeal as a normative concept to evaluate some event, such as the imperial food plant fire. There are only particular, competing, fragmented, and heterogeneous conceptions of and discourses about justice which arise out of the particular situation of those involved. And so that's this kind of statement on, here's the problem. We can't have a theory of justice. Note, this is directly to the issues of our course as well, right? Justice is clearly an issue of social policy. We want justice. Is that possible? Well, Harvey is arguing under this version of postmodernism, no, it's not. And so really, this argument is not pitched as an argument of left against right. It's more an argument of one version of the left against another version of the left. Having said that, I think Harvey is also arguing against versions of the right which would reduce humans primarily to atomistic, to individuals first, to having individual wants and desires first, and which don't take into account any kind of social position with any of that. He's clearly talking to us as people who are embedded in a place, and he wants to talk about place in this kind of dialectical format. I mentioned a moment ago that there's a fissure on the right as well, and I think it's very clear for all to see these days. There's a fissure between what you might think of as neoconservatism on the right, which is a kind of a version of economics, almost libertarian economics, and on the other hand, what you might think of as social conservatives, which you might think of as evangelicals and fundamentalists. These two groups do not always get along well together. And the reasons for that are pretty clear, it seems to me. I mean, if you are essentially libertarian, your sense of where ethics lies is going to be worked out in the marketplace. If you are a social conservative, that's not where it's worked out at all. It's coming from somewhere else. It's coming from God. It's coming from history. It's coming from something else. But it's embedded within us. It's not simply negotiated by us. You can see this in a shift on the right towards on things like gay marriage, for example. There is a conservative argument for gay marriage. Dick Cheney is a supporter of gay marriage. He's a neoconservative in that he is not a social conservative, and so you can see there's a similar huge fissure on the right as there is on the left, and so the conversations sometimes get boiled down to right versus left. But I think that's way too simplistic usually. Harvey is somebody who I think his positionality in all of this is clear. He thinks that it's a complex world out there, and that we can't simply have a kind of idealistic or abstract version of what that looks like through some economic model or something like that. We have to take real experience into account, which is why he keeps going back to real examples of, the conditions under which things like this Imperial Foods fire happened, and the Triangle Shirt Factory fire, which was, the famous incident that produced a whole lot of labor legislation back in the 1910s or 20s. I've forgotten the date. So Harvey is setting up the kind of discussion slightly differently from Gadamer, but I think they're doing some similar kinds of things. Harvey, too, he's going to want to have a version of universalism that Gadamer is going to cash out somewhat differently, I think. I mean, Gadamer thinks that our interpretation is universal, but there's no principle that's universal. Harvey, I think, is going to want to say there's some bare things that we can say about justice that really should apply to everyone. I mean, we should all be able to criticize apartheid in South Africa. We should all be able to criticize the abuses of the Saudi government over their citizens. We should all be able to criticize, we could probably make a list of injustices in the world, and, Harvey's going to be somebody who wants to say these are not a matter of, kind of localized conversations about something. These are issues of injustice, no matter who you are. Okay, so that's a different version, another kind of option in our kind of list of options, and that's something we have to think about. What does it mean to have a theory of justice? Does that require a certain form of knowledge? Does it require a basis? We could go all the way back to, Plato talked about justice clearly in the Republic. Aristotle does too, and their theories of justice are very much rooted in something that's beyond us, even though for Plato it's in a dialectical format. There is certainly a sense that justice is about the well-orderedness of our virtues, right? So it's a meta virtue, as it were, a virtue about virtues, and the virtues have to be in a certain kind of order, or there's a problem. We've seen a number of theories of justice that have a notion of justice that's out there. We've seen a number of others which would want to say, if we do that, we are going to miss a lot of human experience. People are not really going to be able to be heard. Gayatri Spivak, a post-colonial writer, talks about what she calls the subaltern. And the subaltern is somebody who experiences multiple forms of oppression. She's talking specifically about very oppressed people in India, which is where she's from. And those are the people, she has a very famous essay called The Subaltern Cannot Speak. And what she really means is the subaltern can't be heard because their forms of oppression cancel each other out. It's like the move from second wave to third wave feminism. Second wave feminism tended to be a liberal version of feminism, which wanted to bring women into the economic marketplace and business and all those sorts of things. And the third wave feminists basically said, well, this is really white liberal women's feminism. It doesn't understand what it means to be a black woman. It doesn't understand what it means to be a disabled woman, or anyone that has multiple kinds of experience. It's simply reinscribing a certain kind of hierarchy. All right. So anyway, I think that's some of what's going on in the back of a lot of this. What both Gadamer and Harvey are talking about here. I hope some of that clarifies a bit of it. And I'm interested in what you have to say in the discussion period. So please have at it. Please also go and see if you can add something to the discussion about contemporary issues in relation to the course, because I think that'll really, for a lot of us, will help clarify just what all this stuff is about. Like, well, how do we make these theoretical approaches practical in today's world? So that's what we're doing, and I will talk to you again soon. Thanks.